begin with the 10th lecture on Deuteronomy. Today we will look at chapters 18, 19, and 20. Let us begin with chapter 18. The title of chapter 18 is The Portion of the Priests. First, the inheritance of the Levites and the portion of the priests, verses 1 through 8. Second, do not follow occult practices, verses 9 through 14. Third, foretell that a prophet like Moses will rise, verses 15 through 19. Fourth, identify and punish false prophets, verses 20 through 22. Read verses 1 and 2. The Levitical priests, indeed the whole tribe of Levi, are to have no allotment or inheritance with Israel. The Levites do not engage in worldly businesses. They are specially tasked to do God's work. Thus, they do not have any worldly portions. This is the reason why they live off tithes and food offerings offered to God. God Himself is the inheritance for the priests and Levites. If you read verses 3 through 5, the share of the food due to the priests are mentioned. They can only eat the bull and sheep and its thigh parts. The first fruits of the grain, wine, olive oil are their portions also. Leviticus chapter 7, verses 32 through 34. Numbers chapter 18, verses 25 through 32. Verse 6. If a Levite man moves from one of your towns anywhere in Israel where he is living, and comes in all earnestness to the place the Lord will choose. The Levites and the priests lived scattered in many regions of the land of Judah. The Levites lived in the middle of the land that the 12 tribes had inherited. This was so that the Levites would lead and teach the people. 1 Kings chapter 6, verses 54 through 81. The priests who were descendants of Aaron lived throughout the land by drawing lots. However, there were some among them who wished to serve in the Jerusalem temple instead of living in their inherited lands. They were granted to do so if they wanted to. Verse 9. When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not learn to imitate the detestable ways of the nations there. It says that the Israelites must not imitate the detestable practices of the Canaan tribes when they enter the land. The Canaan tribes practiced the occult. Verse 10 says the Canaan tribes sacrificed their sons and daughters in fires. The Canaan tribes burnt and sacrificed their children to Satan. This is a detestable practice. Idolatry is sin. It is murder. It says that no one who practices sorcery, interprets omens, or engages in witchcraft should be found among them. It says that no one who casts spells, who is a spiritist, or who consults the dead should be found among them. 1 Samuel chapter 28 verse 9. Deuteronomy chapter 15 verse 5. 1 Samuel chapter 28 verse 11 through 14. Even in present times, it is wrong to seek palm readers and others who engage in such activities. Verse 13. You must be blameless before the Lord your God. It says that because God is blameless, they must be blameless as well. They must not serve idols, but must only serve God. Verse 15. The Lord your God will raise you up for a prophet like me from among you, from your fellow Israelites. You must listen to him. It says that a prophet like Moses will rise among them. This symbolizes that many prophets are to come in the future. This also symbolizes the coming of Jesus. It prophesies the coming of Jesus as the great prophet. John chapter 6 verse 14. God sends true prophets. In today's time, God has sent Jesus Christ. The latter half of verse 16 says that the Israelites heard God's voice at Mount Horeb. The Israelites were afraid when they heard God's voice. This is the reason why the Israelites appointed Moses as their mediator and received God's words from him. Moses is the mediator of the law. Likewise, Jesus Christ is the mediator between God and us. Verse 18. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their fellow Israelites. Jesus Christ will be sent as the prophet. This means that all must listen to the commands of Jesus and obey everything. Verse 20. But a prophet who presumes to speak in my name anything I have not commanded, or a prophet who speaks in the name of other gods, is to be put to death. We must discern who the false prophets are. They become prophets by themselves and therefore are not sent from God. It says that those false prophets should be put to death. Verse 12. If what a prophet proclaims in the name of the Lord does not take place or come true, that is a message the Lord has not spoken. That prophet has spoken presumptuously, so do not be alarmed. Even if false prophets prophesy, their proclaims will not come true. It does not take place at all. It does not come true. On the other hand, whatever the true prophets prophesy will take place. Since true prophets prophesy exactly what God tells them, it will come true. Many false prophets appear even in present times. There are pastors who teach the Bible incorrectly. There are also those who proclaim that they are Christ when they are not. A heretic group prophesied that the second coming will take place in 1884. Yet it did not come true. It did not come true. They were false prophets. The word of God and prophecies come true. Therefore we must discern and banish false prophets. Now let us begin with chapter 19. The title of this chapter is The City of Refuge. First, those who will flee to the city of refuge, verses 1 through 10. Second, those who cannot escape to the city, verses 11 through 13. Third, do not move the boundary stone, verse 14. Fourth, the matter for the accused should be settled with 2 or 3 witnesses, verse 15. Fifth, punishment of the false witnesses, verses 16 through 21. Read verse 1. When the Lord your God has destroyed the nations whose land he is giving you, and when you have driven them out and settled in their towns and houses, verse 2, then set aside for yourselves 3 cities in the land the Lord your God is giving you to possess. It says to build 3 cities of refuge. It says that when the Israelites enter into Canaan, they are to build 3 cities of refuge. There were 3 cities to the east of the Jordan River. There were 3 other cities to the west of the river. Joshua chapter 20, verses 7 through 8. When they were done, they were to pave the road so that people could easily flee to those cities. This is meant for the people's quick escape before their enemies pursued them. The first reason God told them to set aside the cities of refuge was to save the lives of those who mistakenly murdered another by letting them flee to save their lives. That is, to redeem those who mistakenly committed murder. The second reason was to show that Jesus Christ is going to be the city of refuge for his chosen people. Today, Jesus Christ is the city of refuge. He is the refuge. We are saved from the power of Satan and from death. We receive the protection of Jesus. Romans chapter 8, verses 1 through 2. Jesus Christ is our only Redeemer, refuge, and place of rest. Only those who unintentionally committed murder can escape to the city of refuge. For example, if a woodcutter swings his axe to cut wood, and the axe flies off and kills a person, he can go to the city of refuge. In the case of such an accident, people were allowed to flee to the city of refuge to save his life. However, verse 11 says that those who intentionally kill a person should be put to death. Verse 11. But if out of hate someone lies in wait, assaults and kills a neighbor, and then flees to one of these cities, this is not a case of an accident. It is to hate a neighbor and kill him on purpose. These people cannot escape to the city of refuge. Even if they do, they are to be caught and be put to death. That is, a person who committed murder on purpose must receive judgment. The sin of murder must be cleansed. God despises injustice and judges with righteousness. Verse 14. Do not move your neighbor's boundary stone set up by your predecessors in the inheritance you receive in the land the Lord your God is giving you to possess. It says, do not move the boundary stone. Predecessors refer to ancestors. It means that the descendants should not move the boundary stone the ancestors set as they pleased. There was no way of properly measuring land in the past. Hence, they set boundaries in the lands with trees or stones. Therefore, boundary lines were not accurate. One was able to easily move the boundary stone when no one was looking, thereby expanding one's land. This was to do evil. One must not let greed overtake them. To move the boundary stone is to commit robbery. Envying others' property is not allowed. One should be grateful and content with the proportions given by God. We must not trespass one's rights or properties. Romans chapter 15, verse 20. Verse 15. One witness is not enough to convict anyone accused of any crime or offense they may have committed. A matter must be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. Let us say that a man committed sin. The man should not be convicted of an offense with only one witness. Instead, there should be 2 or 3 witnesses to convict his offense. This means that solid evidence is required. No one should be falsely judged or charged to death. Jesus said this in Matthew chapter 18, verse 16. Proverbs chapter 18, verse 17. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 19. we ought to condemn and punish a person after reviewing solid evidence. Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 4. Verse 16. If a malicious witness takes the stand to accuse someone of a crime, what should they do if there is a false witness? One should be judged before the priest and the judge. One should be charged according to the evil he or she committed. The person must be condemned according to the evil that he or she committed. Verse 21. Show no pity. Life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Eye for eye, life for life. If one harms someone's eye, that person's eye should be harmed as well. However, this is not personal vengeance. This means that the judge must judge with fairness. One should love his or her enemies. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. Yet on a public level, sins should be dealt with strictly. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 15. Justice must be uplifted in public. However, personal vengeance is not allowed. One must love his or her enemies. We must love God and love our neighbors as ourselves. This is the meaning of the fair judgment mentioned in verse 21. Let us begin now with the lecture on chapter 20. The title is, Do Not Be Afraid of War. First, do not be afraid of enemies and fight. Verses 1 through 4. Second, those who are not qualified to be in war. Verses 5 through 9. Third, offer peace as much as possible. Verses 10 through 11. Fourth, destroy the enemies. Verses 12 through 18. Fifth, save the trees during battle. Verses 19 through 20. I will repeat the last 3 points again. Offer peace as much as possible. Verses 10 through 11. Fourth, destroy the enemies. Verses 12 through 18. Fifth, save the trees during battle. Verses 19 through 20. Save the trees during battle. Verses 19 through 20. Read chapter 20, verse 1. When you go to war against your enemies and see horses and chariots and an army greater than yours, do not be afraid of them, because the Lord your God, who brought you up out of Egypt, will be with you. The Israelites needed to conquer the Canaan land and enter the land. There were enemies in that land. However, even though they had greater weapons and armies, the Israelites did not need to be afraid. They did not need to be afraid because God is Almighty. God will be with us and lead us to victory. Our God is the God who delivered the Israelites out of Egypt. Thus we must not be afraid of our enemies, no matter how strong they may be. God will fight for us. What is our enemy today? Our enemy is the outwardly antithetical thoughts of the truth. Next is heresy and heretical ideologies. Inwardly, it is the sinful nature within us. Galatians chapter 5, verses 19 through 21. Our fight is not between flesh and blood. We must wear the full armor of God. Ephesians chapter 6, verses 13 through 17. Verse 3. He shall say, Hear, Israel, today you are going into battle against your enemies. Do not be faint-hearted or afraid. Do not panic or be terrified by them. It says to trust in God's power and do not be afraid. When we trust in God, we can fight courageously. Verse 5. The officers shall say to the army, Has anyone built a new house and not yet begun to live in it? Let him go home, or he may die in a battle, and someone else may begin to live in it. Those who cannot fight in the battle are mentioned here. The officers distinguished those who could not fight in the battle. First, those who built a new house and had not yet lived in it were to return home. Second, those who planted a vineyard and had not enjoyed it yet were to go back. Third, those who were engaged but had not been married yet were to return home. Fourth, those who were afraid to fight were allowed to leave. These people were those who were attached to the world. These people could not take part in God's battle. Those who could fight in the battle must be like the courageous 300 men of Gideon's army. We must not look back. Genesis chapter 19, verse 26. We must not look back with a plow in one hand. We must win the fight by trusting and leaning solely on God's power. Whether we have worldly possessions or not, we must not be subjects to them. We must move forward with our eyes set on God. Verse 10. When you march up to attack a city, make its people an offering of peace. This verse begins to mention how battles must be fought. First, it says to make its people an offer of peace. This does not refer to the Canaanites. This refers to the enemies who are staying in the far areas from Canaan. It says to make an offer of peace to them and make them offer tributes if they surrender. Verse 12. If they refuse to make peace and they engage you in battle, lay siege to that city. If they refused to fight, the Israelites were to engage in battle. In battle, all people from the land of the enemies were to be put to death. All men were to be put to the sword. Yet there were people who were to be left alive. Verse 14. As for the women, the children, the livestock, and everything else in the city, you may take these as a plunder for yourselves, and you may use the plunder the Lord your God gives you from your enemies. It says the woman, the children, and the livestock were to be spared from death. The men were present in the battle fighting. It is saying that those who confront the Israelites are to be put to death. However, those who do not fight in the battle, that is, the women and the children, should be left alive. They are part of the plunder. The plunder is to be used for God's kingdom. All the enemies outside the Canaan land should first be given an offer of peace. But if they decline the offer, they are to be conquered by force. Verse 15. This is how you are to treat all the cities that are at a distance from you and do not belong to the nations nearby. This means that all distant cities are to be treated this way. Verse 16. However, in the cities of the nations the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. However, the enemies in the Canaan land are to be completely destroyed. All the nations in that land are to be put to death. These people are heinous sinners. They were idolaters. They were those who burned their children. In verse 17, 7 tribes are mentioned. They are 7 enemies. People are usually influenced by those who are close to them. The influence of sin becomes greater if the closely located and sinful Canaanites were left alone. That is, the evil people near the Israelites were to be punished. That is why the Israelites were not allowed to marry the Canaanites. Even in the present time, a believer should marry a believer. If one gets close to a suit, he or she will turn black. Those who get close to sin will commit sin. One will become a bad person if they befriend a bad person. All sins are to be cut off. Sin must not be tolerated. Verse 18. Otherwise they will teach you to follow all the detestable things they do in worshiping their gods, and you will sin against the Lord your God. The Canaanites did many detestable things. Therefore they were to be eliminated. Otherwise the Israelites would follow their sinful examples. We must hate sin. Yet a sinner is to be loved and sin to be hated. Verses 19 through 20. When you lay siege to a city for a long time, fighting against it to capture it, do not destroy its trees by putting an axe to them, because you can eat their fruit. Do not cut them down. Are the trees people that you should besiege them? However, you may cut down trees that you know are not fruit trees, and use them to build siege works until the city at war with you falls. This is saying that fruit trees are not to be cut down. Instead of being cut down, the trees should be utilized. The people will regret cutting down trees. They will be sorry after all the lands have been conquered. Thus, we must discern all things with wisdom and cut those that need to be cut out of our lives. At the same time, we must think about the future. We might be sorry later on, once we cut everything out of our lives, because they do not seem necessary at the moment. That is why the Israelites were told to preserve the fruit trees and enjoy them in the future. With this, we will conclude the 10th lecture on Deuteronomy. Thank you.